to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to the TheraTribe podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
And last time we talked about the different stages of trauma and how your body experiences that. Now we're going to go a little deeper into what is happening in each of those stages.
Yeah, so last time we talked about, for a quick recap, we did talk about the four stages of the arousal cycle. So I like to kind of slow down a little bit and go into a little bit more detail, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Before we do that, I do want to mention that trauma, we store the trauma memories a little differently than we do all the other memories. We normally, when you're like listening to this podcast, everything is sequential and you might remember it in order. But trauma memories a lot of times are fragmented. They are non-narrative. That means we can't follow a story sometimes. It's just pieces and bits and it doesn't all flow together, and it may be out of order time-wise, things like that.
So we'd think of a story having a beginning, a middle, and an end. We'd think of having the villain introduced before the conflict really gets stirred up, and this is totally nonlinear.
Totally nonlinear most of the time, and again, fragmented. And it's because it's non-narrative. It's all trauma happens in the right side of our brain, where that's the non-verbal portion of our brain. And it does it because it's an imprint on our nervous system, so to speak. That's really what it is. It's an imprint on our sensory, our senses, our emotions, our body, our thoughts. It's an imprint on all of those. And so we experience it mostly in the right side of our brain. A lot of it can be unavailable for verbal recall. So for instance, if you have a client that has experienced childhood trauma, they know they've had trauma, but they can't go, this is what happened to me. They can say, I have these feelings, I have these symptoms, I have these responses, but I don't know what happened.
Yeah. And if you're hearing this now and you've had any difficulty putting words to what your experience even was, I definitely recommend you check in with yourself to see how you're feeling about that, because, it's not so uncommon to feel self-conscious about knowing something happened to you, but not knowing how to put it into words. That can, you might feel some kind of way about that, but at least if you're talking to somebody like one of us, there's nothing wrong with taking your time with it. And sometimes circling the thing a few times to kind of figure out what it is you're even looking at. Some of these things, think about it almost like, I hope this is not going to be too far out in left field, but I think some of you will relate to it. Think about how, if you ever do dream journaling, sometimes the things that you'll start to remember more stuff by putting down what little you do remember. And I don't know why it works that way, but it works that way.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Remember that a trauma survivor, regardless of the cause of the trauma, regardless of what they remember or how they remember it, they can experience all the symptoms in each of the stages. So as you experience those symptoms that we're going to talk about, like Jeremy said, it might be wise to just write it down and see what comes to mind.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can jar that quite a bit. So yes.
And what little I do understand of that process is that there's a difference between observing something from completely outside of it, like watching through a window, versus describing what you're seeing from inside of it. And writing, journaling is one of those ways that you step inside of the thing. So the connections that are starting to form seem to be forming because, well, like you said, this whole thing is like an imprint on your nervous system. In a way, you're stepping inside of it like being inside of a nervous system. Hopefully that's not getting too abstract to follow, but I think that that's part of kind of what's happening.
Yes, it is. It's kind of, and that's exactly what's happening. And that imprint, it changes our neural pathways. And so we'll talk about that in other episodes, I think, but it's like we get stuck almost in a maze of a fingerprint, if you think of it that way, that imprint on our nervous system. And our nervous system touches every piece of us. So it is a neurobiological response to trauma. That is literally what happens. So we might think it's all in our head, or we're just making it up, especially if we are conditioned to say, well, that was a small trauma, or that was not a trauma at all. What was that? But if we perceived it as a trauma, then we would be fighting our biology to not recognize that, because it's going to happen. I take a bite of lunch, I eat it, I can't help my body digesting it. It's going to do that, right? That's what it does. I can't make it stop. So it's the same thing with trauma, right?
Yeah, I think that just the previous minute of this one thing, like if you played that back 10 times, you might get more from it each time.
Well, it is definitely a biological response. And I think that we're so hard on ourselves and other people when, it's like, well, just get up and move on. But I can't stop digesting my lunch. It's going to continue to digest no matter what I do.
You set something in motion.
Yeah, I've set it in motion. There was an event and now my stomach is digesting, right?
Yeah.
That's what happens. And that's exactly what happens with trauma. So we have an event. We have something that's highly stressful that happens. That's what we're going to say, that's the beginning of what's going to happen from the stages. So when it happens, it's something that we perceive that exceeds our personal resources or our capacity to deal with this particular highly stressful situation or event. So when that happens, we feel overwhelmed because my resources, my capacity they're not equal to the event, that stressful event that's occurring.
Yeah.
At that point, stage 1 kicks back in. If you remember from the previous episode, I talked about stage 1 being, that's when we become hyper aware of what's going on. We're looking for data. We're looking to see, is this really a danger? Am I going to die here or am I going to be okay? That kind of taking it in.
It's enough of an attention getter, but you're still kind of sussing it out.
Yes. And so when that happens, the symptoms that go along with stage 1 would align with that. So you would have your hypervigilance. So you're going to be on guard here. Extreme sensitivity to light and sound because everything is like taking it all in. Hyperactivity. So you're starting to get really moving a lot, restless, agitation, all of that starting to build. Your startle response will get larger and quicker in this particular, because you're ready to move to stage 2. You're waiting to see if you need to. You cannot really sleep in this stage very well. And then there's your heart rate will start increasing. Your breathing will start getting faster and a little bit more ragged.
Let me ask you this. You said you can't really sleep very well in this stage. How long does this stage tend to last?
Well, if we're talking about a single event, we're talking about in a moment, not very long at all, because you move into stage 2.
Okay. That
said, when we have had trauma that's unresolved and we're triggered later on, we jump back into this. And remember too, as we go through each of the stages, we don't lose the previous symptoms. They stay with us.
Yeah. Along with whatever meaning we attach to our ability to handle them.
Yes. Which would mean that we are in excess of our capacity, or we feel like we are in excess of our capacity, or we don't have enough resources or have capable resources to meet this threat. Okay.
Yeah.
So if that continues, there are some psychological symptoms that happen in stage 1. So those were physical symptoms that I just described. They will happen first. Then our psychological systems or symptoms will jump in. When I say first and the second, they're like split seconds apart. Okay. So it's not a long thing.
It is a progression, but it's not all spaced
Yeah,
out.
it's a very fast progression now, right?
It's like going through gear 1 to get to gear 2.
Yeah, if we are in stage 1 of a previous trauma, right? Well, that's when we'll have our intrusive thoughts or intrusive memories or flashbacks, our nightmares. Night terrors is another one that if an adult has night terrors, we really need to figure out what's going on. We have affect dysregulation. That means we can't regulate our own moods.
So affect will be a term that isn't necessarily used by the general population quite the same way we generally use it in counseling. So that's sort of like your ability to express emotion.
Yes, it's your ability to express how you're feeling, or even to regulate it, keep it within a particular range that is comfortable and not out of control. And what might happen is if you're unable to regulate your emotions, you might show temper tantrums or rage, or extreme sense of shame is another one, debilitating sadness, things like that.
And you can even think of that as being part of the same word, affection. If it's hard to remember that this is what we mean when we say that, affect, affection.
Feelings for this, yes. Another thing that comes in is because you are trying to deal with that trauma that you haven't resolved, that one that you're stuck in time with. And so because you're already stressed, you have the hyper arousing, so you have all of the hypervigilance, really on guard, you've got all that going on. And then you've got, your thoughts going on, your flashbacks. You are already going, I am past my limit. I have no capacity to deal with this event, whether it's happening really now, or if you're just been triggered and it's happening for you in your experience. So you don't have capacity for any other stress. Your capacity for stress really diminishes at this point because you're already overwhelmed. So you don't have much.
Could I ask you, another thing that's kind of coming into the vernacular that I think a lot of people are familiar with the term highly sensitive person, and maybe a lot of people listening identify as a highly sensitive person. When you mentioned being like increased sensitivity to, like, let's say, light and sound, would this phenomenon of like being a highly sensitive person often be connected with trauma, or would we be connecting the wrong dots there?
You're connecting some different dots. They can mimic each other because there are some similarities. However, highly sensitive people are actually born with a highly sensitive nervous system. It's about 20% of the population. It's a physical difference. This is an actual trauma response. And so people who may not have been born with a highly sensitive nervous system will jump into that highly sensitive space, but that's not their biology normally. Someone who is highly sensitive, that is their normal biology. There's actually on that's a side note, but there's actually on Amazon Prime, there's a really good documentary, it's about an hour long, called Sensitives. And it's a very good discussion of what a highly sensitive person might look like. And very positive too, because those are our leaders. They are the forward thinkers. There's also a good book, Highly Sensitive Person, but I really don't remember who wrote it. So, but you can find, it's literally called Highly Sensitive Person on Amazon, I'm sure, as well.
So that's I think a good opportunity to say that we don't need to make a problem where there's not one. It's good to be aware if something is disrupting your life and making it hard for you to function normally. If you're dissatisfied with your ability to show up and be a person in your own life, then that's worth exploring. But I know I'm not trigger happy when it comes to putting a label on people, and I would encourage you not to treat yourself that way either.
Yes. Now that said, I will say if someone is highly sensitive, their trauma reactions might be faster. There may be more things that cause the trauma reactions, and they may be more intense when they do have them. But that's in response to their own biology, as this trauma response kicks into their biology. At this point, we're in stage 1. There is the only left brain response starts in stage 1. And this is that racing thoughts and the worry. That's the only stage, that's the only left brain thing that happens in all of the trauma response right there. It's just that racing thoughts and worry, which aren't productive anyway. So once that happens, we move into our second stage of trauma. And so things change, our physical symptoms at this point. And this is, if you remember from the episode right before this one, Stage 2 is where your adrenaline and your cortisol really start increasing, and you get ready to run or fight. Right? Your fight or flight kicks in. Your physical symptoms may be a physical panic attack. You may feel that in your chest, in that breathing, and your heart start pounding, that kind of thing. Agitation, anxiety, if you're thinking what that feels like, that shaking or that really tense kind of thing going on. If you're looking at a trigger and you're in a trauma response after the event has happened, you will avoid things in this particular one. You won't be able to walk past a place where you had your accident, for instance. And your sexual activity, by the way, will either be exaggerated and you may have a lot more, or it may be diminished significantly in this stage. Those are physical symptoms of stage 2.
Okay.
Some psychological symptoms which always follow. And by the way, these symptoms that I'm mentioning them are in order. You'll have abrupt mood swings in this stage if it's a flashback, if it's a triggered moment. Whether you're in the actual event at the time or later, this is where you will start dissociating. And this is where you have an altered state. So it's kind of a mental blankness or a spaciness. You're no longer present here in the here and now. Anger, crying.
Do you think people are normally pretty aware of themselves doing that? Or does dissociation sometimes hard to catch?
It's hard to catch sometimes. I hear it when people don't remember things. So if you think about a child who's been abused, for instance, and they dissociate, they go to school and they're sitting there and this trauma response happens in the middle of math class because their math teacher reminds them of the abuser for some reason.
Which could be anything, right?
Could be anything. Could just be the clothes that he or she wears, or the way that they speak, or we don't know what that is. And so this child, or it could just be the room or the situation where this child is sitting, or an internal something that happened. And so that child is not paying attention. So the child is going to get bad grades in math and not actually learn it because the child never was actually present in math, but not really knowing it. Now the teacher may be aware and they may call the child scatterbrained or refuses to concentrate or whatever, but the child is literally sitting in this trauma response, is unable to be fully present, right?
And
we do that as adults.
And not knowing how to ask for help.
Yeah, not knowing. I mean, the child doesn't really know that they're struggling with that. I say it as a child because we can all relate to that, but adults do the same thing, right? I will sometimes have adults say, that went by really fast, talking about something like, I think I missed part of it. We all dissociate somewhat. If we're driving, we might not remember all of the red lights. We might get to our place and go, did I stop at the red lights? Was I speeding? Was I driving okay? Because we spaced out. That is a form of dissociation. So we all do it. So sometimes we're aware, but we're not really aware while we're doing it, right? Just like if I'm dissociating while I'm driving, I'm obviously not aware that I'm dissociating, or I'll stop it because I need to drive. So but I may know later. We may or may not, just depends.
And that was the end of stage 2?
Well, it was part of stage 2.
Oh,
it's one of the psychological symptoms of stage 2 is where this comes in. If we had been abused or had trauma in the past, and if it's been triggered, we might also be attracted to risky situations, which is crazy, right? You wouldn't think that we would be, but it is a symptom of stage 2. We're attracted to that. At the same time, we might develop amnesia and forgetfulness, where our right brain is working, but our left brain is off. It's off track. So it's not really recording. So we may or may not remember what's happening here. At this point, we may have a serious fear of dying, sense of doom. We're going to die early. We don't have a sense of the future. I see a lot of people who've been traumatized who have no hope. There's no vision for the future. We'll talk with teenagers and they're making stupid choices, as they'll say. And it's kind of like, this is going to hurt you later on. And they're like, okay, yeah. But they don't really see that because they have this, they're not going to live that long.
All they have access to is this moment.
This moment, that's exactly right. They know they're going to die. They're in this moment. And they'll feel helpless at this point. We add another section. So like stage 1 had physical and psychological type symptoms. Stage 2 has physical, psychological, and relational symptoms. And here we will avoid other people and we might isolate more. And this is because we're overwhelmed. Everything is firing and we just can't, another person is more than we can handle. So we isolate if we're in stage 2.
And can that be different things, or is it it's just the situation calls for more energy than we have, or the situation is too stimulating?
It's too stimulating, I think. We everything is firing. And so we're taking in, normally you and I are sitting here right now and our brain is taking, I forget how many thousands of bits of data per second, but we filter most of that out. When we're in stage 2 and we've got all of stage 1 symptoms as well as stage 2 firing, we're not filtering much out and we overwhelm our system. And then we have stage 3, and there's some changes. We have some medical issues that come up. In stage 3, the physical symptoms, we might start getting headaches. If we stay in this a long time, if we have chronic trauma, we have a lot of trauma that happens, or we have a long time of unresolved trauma, we can get things like, this is where you get your chronic fatigue might come up. Your immune system, certain endocrine problems will come up. Thyroid issues will come up. Psychosomatic illnesses. This is what Freud called conversion, but this would be where there's nothing physically wrong with us, but our body is responding as if there's something physically wrong with us.
These are more things that you might come away from a doctor's appointment just confused.
Yes, yes, that happens some. But these first things I'm mentioning, these are actual illnesses caused by the stress. Headaches, chronic fatigue, thyroid dysfunction, your immune system, your endocrine system have problems. They literally can test that in the doctor's office. Neck and back problems, you'll start hurting in your neck and back. Asthma is another one of those that is part of that. Irritable bowel syndrome, which can be pretty life-threatening sometimes, spastic colon, severe PMS for the women, and eating disorders. These are some that will show up if you stay in stage 3 very long.
Wow, it's just another reality check when it comes to like, if we don't maintain our mental and emotional health. Yeah, guess what? It turns out it is connected to your physical health.
It absolutely is. So there's some more psychological, those are more medical symptoms. There's some psychological, physical and psychological and relational issues along with stage 3. And it would be excessive shyness for one.
Is that, would you say that's the same as social anxiety?
No, it's different.
Okay.
This is different. Diminished emotional responses at this point, where we are moved over to that freeze state at this point. So we're no longer like overly stimulated. We're shutting down to die. So we have diminished emotional responses at this stage. So depression will come in here maybe. And we will just have this feeling of impending doom. I'm walking through life, I'm going to die. So it's like that. And because of that, our relational symptoms are going to be inability to make true commitments. I'm going to die anyway. How can I commit to you? Right. And so you disconnect from other people in this stage. And then we add in this one spiritual symptoms that we look for as clinicians. And it's like feeling like you are a zombie, a living dead. You're detached, you're alienated, you're isolated. And so you've disconnected yourself from yourself, the mysteries of yourself, and from the world and the mysteries of the world. So there are those spiritual symptoms in stage 2. Stage 3, the final stage.
What about for those who really just don't use that terminology whatsoever and don't really look at life through a lens of spirituality? Would it be maybe just feeling like you're floating instead of being part of anything?
Yeah, it would be that. And as I use the spiritual term is actually the clinical term, and it's around those mysteries, being connected to all of the mysteries of connection through life that you no longer have. So in that spiritual term, it's not talking about being religious or anything like that. It's literally just being connected to the mysteries of life, which is part of what we do. I'm trying so hard to remember the name of the philosopher who wrote the story of the guy on trial who was in that state. And I will have to say it in the next episode, I think. So make sure you listen for the next one. But the guy was on trial, and what people were actually convicting him around was not the actual crime, but it was around his disconnect from the world and his inability to feel emotion towards the crime. But he was obviously in this state. I will have to look that name up of the philosopher who wrote that novel and tell you what the name of the novel and the philosopher is in the next episode. I will surely do that. But they were convicting him on that. And all he was really responding to was he was in that final stage. And so he was disconnected from the mysteries of life. He just didn't really care where we came from, what we were going to do. He didn't care about dying at that point because he had shut down. He was prepared to die. And our bodies do that. Our neurobiology does that, shuts us down emotionally and physically and mentally. Because, if I were being attacked by a lion, frankly, I want to shut down. If they're going to eat all my insides, please let me not know that that's happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
So it shuts us down for that.
It's like that one moment in the first Matrix movie, right?
Yes.
Like, I don't want to know.
I don't want to know anything.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's partly why when people are dying on their deathbed and they get this sense of calm, they're like, I'm okay now, I'm ready to die. It's because they've moved into this actual final stage where they realize they're helpless and hopeless and there is no future. And so things start shutting down and they really don't care. And it does ease us into death as well. So there's some benefits to this. But if we are still living and we're not dying, then we can't continue to live in a state that we're preparing to die. We can technically, but what life is that?
Yeah.
Right? We want to move past that and to heal that and grow from that.
Yeah. And there's that familiar phrase. Well, if you've ever spent time in a treatment center, you've no doubt heard this phrase, but a lot of you probably heard it regardless. The only way out is through. Sia even used that phrase in one of her songs. And it's like you do have to reconnect with the pain in order to go through it. Like, was it Winston Churchill that said, if you're going through hell, keep going?
Yes.
And sure, that's terrifying. But is that actually more terrifying than living an existence that's no longer a life? Maybe there's more to live for, and maybe there are higher stakes to play for.
Yeah. And maybe life can be enjoyable and not torturous, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it can.
Maybe there is hope.
Yes.
Oh, was there anything more for the stages that have we left anything out?
Nope, I think we've got the stages. I think we can be. I think the only thing I don't know if I've stressed enough is that these stages happen when the event happens. We go through these stages when the event actually happens and like time-wise, but we also go through the stages every time we're triggered, right? We jump into those stages as well. So it's not just a one-time event. It can happen many times until we resolve that trauma.
And when it's a trigger situation from something that's already gone through that progression of all the stages, do those steps in the process tend to progress rapidly?
Yeah, we pretty much just kind of stay where we left off. So that stage 3, like when I was talking about the spiritual symptoms and the relational symptoms, those pretty well stay all the time. Those don't like abate very much. You live life that way, which really doesn't sound fun at all.
Yeah. And right about now, it might be starting to sound a bit intimidating to learn how to interrupt that process or hope to heal any of it. Be encouraged.
Sorry.
We really wouldn't be making this podcast if we were just introducing you to new ways to be hopeless. So
That's true.
So please stick around. If you've stayed this far, you're definitely going to want to stay for a little bit more, because this is really not the voice of doom and gloom. We're looking to provide you better ways to live your life.
Yes, definitely.
Anything to close up with, or shall we just let them know what to expect next time?
I think we'll let them know what to expect next time, besides the fact that, yes, we know that we can work through this and heal this. That is, I do want to say that. I think next time we're going to talk about the body-brain connection and how that works as it applies to trauma and our trauma responses that I just kind of gave the overview of the stages with.
Yes, sounds great. And we'll have, for those who are interested in following up on things we brought up this time, we'll have specific recommendations for you to check out, including that one philosopher. Yeah, so that's our time for this week. For this time, we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, yes. Bye.